in about 1980. I only was in the same room with Zellig on 2 occasions. So I am a post-Harisian temporally, and I am, in a different way from Lissa, also a grandchild, because I studied at MIT, and one of my teachers was Noam Chomsky. And of course, in linguistics and psychology, the dispute between the Chomskyan and the Harisian approaches to linguistics has assumed epic proportions. I always had a lot of trouble with that. It seemed to me that there was a lot of ideology balancing on a very small number of substantive issues. And I can't tell always whether what I'm saying is Chomskyan or anti-Chomskyan or Harisian or anti-Harisian. And I'm not going to try to do that. I'll let you decide for yourselves whether what I'm saying is a continuation of what Harris was doing, or a response to what Harris was doing, or a counter-argument against what Harris was doing. Probably it's all of those things, because that's the way the world really works, as opposed to the way it works in our fantasies. So, if you'll give me just a minute, I will look for and quickly find the slides. These are the slides that I've put together for the talk. I'm sure that I won't get anywhere near to where I want to get in the short time that I have. So I had better give you the punchline at the beginning for sake of clarity. I want to show you that there is some evidence from the study of historical corpora that it is a common occurrence for languages to actually be mixed from a grammatical point of view. That is to say that the language that people speak is actually not governed by a single set of rules, but by more than one set of rules. And sometimes the writer or the speaker invokes one of the rules, and on other occasions invokes a different rule. Now, in general, you might think this was a difficult thing to see, and of course it is. But we see it in historical situations more clearly than perhaps we could see it synchronically, because we see old forms, which we know will eventually die out of the language, alternating with new forms. And we know from looking at other languages that these old forms and new forms don't coexist comfortably together. A nice example of that is the so-called verb-second constraint. The Germanic languages in general have a rule that the second constituent of any matrix clause, any main sentence, has to be the tensed verb. And English, being a Germanic language, really should have this rule, and Old English and Early Middle English did, but modern English doesn't. And we can trace through the texts of English a period during which both verb-second sentences and non-verb-second sentences occurred, and we can watch the frequency of the verb-second word order decline over time. And over the space of about 250 years, the frequency declines from close to 100% to close to 0. And I've modeled that in my work, and other people have, as what we call grammar competition. Now, there's another way of looking at this, which is actually quite common, which is to say, well, no. What's going on here is you have statistical distributions of types, and a language like Middle English, where you have both verb-second sentences and non-verb-second sentences, doesn't have to be thought of as some kind of mixture of two distributions, but can be thought of simply as a language in which both word orders are licensed by the grammar. In fact, from a purely distributional point of view, you might think that this is a better solution. Why postulate something as complicated as two systems of rules with competition between them, when you could just say you have one system of rules where two different strings of words are both licensed? They happen to have the same meaning in some broad sense. And I want to show you today a little bit of why it might be better to say that you have a mixture of distributions and competition instead of saying that you have a grammar with a broader set of licensed outputs. To the extent that it turns out to be true that you can give evidence for this, it suggests that a purely distributional analysis of a corpus of text, or even of a set of grammaticality judgments, may not be the best linguistic analysis. And that's, I think, the punchline. That it might be the case that if we sit down and we do the best possible linguistic analysis of the data set, and here it doesn't really matter whether this is a corpus or the data is judgments, we might actually come up with the wrong answer, because the psychological processes that are underlying the performance of the writers or speakers are more complex than this model allows for. So this is a summary of a purely distributional analysis. Grammars are constructed to capture regularities in distribution. The best grammar is the most succinct. The grammar is constructed basically without reference to psychological considerations. This is structuralist methodology, and it is the common heritage of all modern linguists. It's a heritage that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, through Saussure and others, and Bloomfield and Harris and Chomsky. Now, and as I said, the question I have is, does this method ever mislead? And I want to argue that there are so-called mixed distributions, or doublets, and that they're found particularly in the course of language change. So the reason I call these things doublets is that the clearest, simplest case to look at is the case of morphological doublets. It's a standard term. And in the history of English, for example, we have lots of doublets for the past tense of verbs, where one of the members of the pair is a strong form or an irregular form, and the other is a weak form. Sometimes the modern language retains the strong form, sometimes the weak form, and for a few verbs we still have doublets, like dived and dove. We did some research on this and found that whenever the doublet had been around in the language, in attested texts for 300 years, one of the forms had dropped out. So it doesn't seem that these doublets are stable. There are, as I said, sometimes syntactic doublets, though. For example, the difference between the verb second sentence. These are not real examples, but if in early Middle English you might have last night came John, and in modern English we would have last night John came. Okay, the lesson of the historical work has been that quite systematically doublets are diachronically unstable. And the question that one might ask is, why should that be if the language is correctly described as simply a distribution of forms? If both of the forms appear, there's positive evidence for both forms, and we just write a grammar which allows both. We might expect some of these doublet forms to sometimes be unstable, but they are actually quite systematically unstable. Now, I want to talk now about two models of language change, which we will then be able to hook back up to this question of the instability of doublets. One is the so-called drift model, which is very widely assumed. That model says, well, what happens to a language is that the relative frequencies of different forms drift over time. Drift is a term that goes back to Sapir. And eventually the drift gets so extreme that perhaps one of the options that used to be possible disappears from the language. Another way of thinking about language change, however, would be to say, no, the drift in usage is not something that happens before the language changes. What happens instead is that the language changes. That is to say, speakers of one group or one generation misacquire from the point of view of what the language was like before, some features of the language. And these misacquired features lead to, if you like, a new dialect. And this new dialect appears in the speech of the community and competes with the old dialect, because not everybody who was acquiring the language misacquired it. And this competition works itself out over time. And eventually, one of the ways of speaking wins out over the other. It's important to understand that in this model, it's not that one set of speakers speaks one way and another set of speakers speak another way. That's not a problem. That's just two speech communities that may live side by side. What we find instead is that once a new form comes into the language of a speech community, everybody uses both forms, both the old and the new form. And the claim of this model is that that's a case of bidialectalism in the community. Now, in order for it to be possible for this kind of bidialectalism to emerge, it has to be the case that it's possible for acquirers of a language to misacquire some features of it. In ordinary descriptive linguistics, there's an assumption that language acquisition is perfect. And for many purposes, that's a perfectly reasonable idealization. But exactly in the case of language change, it's a bit dangerous to assume that language acquisition is perfect. In the case of second language acquisition, it's known to be very, very imperfect. And many cases of language change actually arise out of the imperfections of second language acquisition in cases of language contact. There are also, however, cases which seem like they might come from imperfections in first language acquisition. So one of the things that needs to be done, and I've begun to look at some of these cases, but there's a lot of work, more work that needs to be done, is to look at the time course and the accuracy of first language acquisition. There's been a lot of emphasis in the acquisition literature on the skill that children have in acquiring their first language. It's clearly quite spectacular. The question that I would want to raise from the point of view of the study of language change is whether there are any limits to this skill. Does it ever happen, or to what extent does it happen, that children actually fail to get something that is present in the data? And when we look at the actual studies that have been done, we find that errors of this sort, errors by children, are very, very common. They obviously mostly go away by the time the child is 4 or 5 years old. But they provide us with a population of variability that could potentially be the source of language change. So here, this is just an example of the use in one of the nominative case for the accusative in a German sentence by a German child. Here's a table from a study by Harold Claassen. The thing to look at over here is the columns on the right. You see the 0, 0 is that there are no dative forms in this child's speech where the accusative is expected. But then you see the 4 and the 8. Those are accusative forms where the language actually requires the dative. Now, this is important because it's not the case system that the child hasn't learned. It's the proper use of the accusative and the dative cases. Now, in English, the accusative and the dative have collapsed. So universal grammar here is not going to help the child at all. Because the language doesn't have to distinguish accusative from dative and doesn't have to distinguish them in the way that German does. So the child here is not reproducing the adult pattern perfectly. Eventually, of course, what happens is that the child learns this. But if we think about different situations where the amount of evidence available to the child might rise or fall, depending on particular features of the language, we see here that there's the potential for mislearning and the introduction of a new way of speaking into the community. It's particularly important to understand that the children who are making these kinds of errors are not just learning from models, but are actually also themselves models for other children. So once a child starts to make errors, the learning situation of the other children in his or her immediate vicinity is complicated because these children are hearing both correct and incorrect forms. Alyssa's talk obviously gives us information about how that could be resolved, but it's at least a problem that if children hear incorrect forms from other children, that could lead to another way of doing things becoming part of the language. These are some statistics from Russian. I will go over them very quickly, but the Russian, the descriptions of language acquisition of Russian say that the case system as a system is acquired by the age of 2, in the sense that you can never see with Russian children, once they speak in clauses that show case marking, that you never see a stage where they don't have case marking. But what you do see is a lot of imperfection in the realizations of the case forms, and particularly the ones that are more irregular. So the whole complexity, the morphological complexity of the Russian case system takes quite a long time for the child to acquire. I'll skip this. It's another instance of a problem for learning of Russian. Here, learning learning to use the genitive with a certain class of verbs. Now, how is this all related to language change? Well, as I said to you, I'm interested in a model of language change where at the beginning of the change, what happens is that through some imperfection in transmission, whether it's second language acquisition or perhaps more rarely in the historical data, a failure to learn by children, you get a situation of grammar competition. And I want to oppose this to a case where you get drift of frequencies within a single linguistic system. The standard story for the shift in English from verb final to verb medial word order, this OV to VO shift, which goes back a very long time, the standard story was that you got this shift as a result of a drift in frequencies. And the reason was that in Old English, VO word order occurs. It occurs, however, because the object has been shifted to the end of the sentence, and it's possible to show by grammatical analysis that something like this has happened. And the claim that was made by historical syntacticians was that the rate of that shifting simply went up over time. And when the shifting had become extremely frequent, people just decided that that was the way you had to do things, and they gave up on the old way of doing things. So the model was drift in the frequency of shifting, followed by a reorganization of the rule system so that the unshifted version was no longer possible. But the evidence that Susan Pinsook has come up with, the statistical evidence about how the relative frequencies of these two orders show that that really is unlikely to be true. We can see, to begin with, we see that in sentence 4, we find, this is a sentence from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, this is a sentence which shows VO word order, which Pinsook shows on the basis of grammatical analysis cannot be the result of shift. So the point of this example is to show that VO word order, which is not due to the shift of the object, occurs very early in the historical evolution of the system. So if at this point the frequency of VO word order on the surface is very low, and yet we find examples which seem grammatically not to be examples of the shifted type. Now, if we assume that what we actually have here is a case of a new grammar coming into existence in the community and competing with the old grammar, we would expect these non-shifted VO sentences to be present from the beginning because they're characteristic of the new grammar. If we think that what we're looking at is drift, then the non-shifted type of VO should occur only at the end of the evolution, because they are the result, would then be the result of giving up on the old system and reanalyzing everything as VO. Okay? So this is a critical example. The fact that we find the non-shifted VO sentences, that is to say VO word order not due to shift, from the beginning of the evolution of this process is evidence in favor of saying that the movement in frequencies is not drift but competition between the two forms, the two grammatical systems. Now, here's a little bit more indirect kind of statistical evidence for the same thing. In the top table, you see the frequency of VO word order in Beowulf, which is a very old text from one of the earliest texts of the Old English period. In the bottom table, you see the same frequencies for late Old English, from Old English of about the year 1000. The critical thing to understand, and I can't explain the details, is that the sentences here are grouped into two groups, I initial and I final. The I final cases are cases where the post-verbal word order is due to shift, for sure. The I initial cases are actually ambiguous. If you look at what happens between the early Old English and late Old English in the I final case, you see somewhat of a drop in the rate of shifting. So the rate of shifting has not actually gone up, it's actually gone down. Okay? But when you look at the ambiguous cases, the rate of VO word order has gone up quite a lot between early Old English and late Old English. So why would that be? Well, the argument is, well, that's because the I initial cases are cases which are exhibiting the competition between the old grammar and the new grammar, okay? And the new grammar is winning out over time. And the I final cases are the ones that are only allowed by the old grammar. So there you see only the object shift examples. So what's actually happening is object shift is declining and VO word order is rising. So the standard old analysis that says VO word order is the result of increasing frequency of object shift is really completely inconsistent with this data. I think, because I really don't have time, I won't go through this second case. And instead what I'll say is that having found this kind of you could say, unexpected result in one case, the thing that we did next was start looking for cases and asking ourselves, do we have, what are we seeing here? Do we have evidence for grammatical reanalysis followed by competition versus drift followed by reanalysis? And what we have found in several cases, of which I only presented to you one, is that it's quite a general fact that the kinds of language changes that are attested in these texts, these syntactic changes, look like cases of reanalysis followed by competition and not like cases of drift followed by reanalysis. But, and I guess the take-home message of the talk for this occasion is that a model of the speaker that allows the speaker to have more than one grammatical system makes the relationship between the data of production, the data that we have access to, and the underlying system responsible for it, more complicated than the simplest models have assumed. Thanks. Right. And that's, the interesting question is whether, do we want to say that the distinction between sublanguages is sort of now, are we going to just sort of build that into our grammatical system, right? And then we'll say, no, there's really only one grammar, it just branches, right? Or do we want to think that in the context of a single, if you like, occasion of use, a writer or speaker may actually have available a choice of more than one system, right? And that's the difference between sociolinguistic variation as it's been studied by Lebov and others, where there are real variables in the system, and other ways of talking about that variation which use notions like register, right? And say, no, there's no real linguistic variation, there are just two registers, and the choice of register is just a rule like any other rule, right? And these things can get, whether the one way or the other way is the right way to think about it is a tricky question, but I don't think they're the same way of talking.